A man chooses, a slave obeys.
Welcome to the Ethics in Video Games podcast, where we explore issues at the intersection of ethics and video games.
What follows is a series of graphic, interactive scenes that we can't show you.
We devoted episode 3 of to the classic controversial game 6 Days in Fallujah, which was supposed to be the first major release about a real battle in an ongoing war. And we talked about how games like this are really hard to do. But if there's ever going to be gaming masterpieces that are equal to the cinematic masterpieces like Full Metal Jacket or Apocalypse Now, games need to be able to take chances and tackle real hard, real-world subjects.
That's right.
But as we discussed in that episode, because that game never came to fruition, because they just didn't, they didn't do what they needed to do in terms of meeting those responsibilities. I'm not even sure that's exactly fair because we don't know what the game was really like. So
right.
I don't think they...
Because it blew up on just the announcement of it.
Right.
So the announcement of it created all this furor and got it canceled, basically.
Right. Which is interesting because it was canceled by the right at that time, right? It was mostly conservatives that were objecting to it, and as we'll talk about, we talked about at the time about the double standard, right? That games like this are kind of subjected to because this, that's part of the problem. Movies can do things that games seem to be able not to do in terms of public acceptance. Which, by the way, my wife, listening to our third podcast, said it really helped her understand why games should be taken more seriously.
Good.
So, we've changed at least one person's opinion.
There we go.
But the other one was, this issue about that there's this heavy responsibility in making a game like this. And, the designers really need to treat all the game stakeholders with respect. Now, a couple of days before we recorded that episode, we were surprised to find out that Highwire Games remade 6 Days in Fallujah, and we're planning to release it this year, 2021, if you're listening to this sometime in the future. We didn't have time to see what they were doing, but now we have 2 trailers to work with. And we have some ability to get an idea of what they're trying to deal with to make a challenging game like this. So today, I'm really excited to talk about these 2 trailers. I am going to pop this over, full screen it, and okay. So this is the original announcement trailer.
Saddam had been captured. The Iraqi army scattered. Lawlessness and fear gave al-Zarqawi his moment, and he was prepared. They seized Fallujah, and the city was the first to suffer under their black banner.
These terrorists were armed to the teeth. No one will fight against them.
It had to be stopped, or the country will turn over to Al-Qaeda.
It was a fortress. It was a well-prepared city, buttressed, waiting for us to come.
The only way you can clear a city is you have to search every house, you have to search every room, and you have to root out every insurgent.
We sustained hundreds and hundreds of casualties. A third of my battalion was killed or wounded.
It was the bunkers they would build inside houses. And you would go in the house, it'd be all quiet. And then they would open up on you or shoot you through a hole in the wall.
If they didn't hit you right away with a machine gun, they would draw you all the way back to the back of the house where there's really nowhere to escape.
There's such a fear, so you're standing in front of the door. You kick down that door, and there's a sense of relief. You only feel it if you survive.
Okay. So the first thing that really struck me about this trailer, and this is obviously just a part of the trailer, but just how different it was from the 2009 trailer, right? So there's a 2009 trailer where 6 Days in Fallujah is announced, and there's no soldiers or Iraqis. It's just the president of Atomic Games talking about what they wanted to do, right? And he said kind of the similar stuff in terms of the goal, right? In that trailer, he talked about how their goal was to convey the experiences of the soldiers, but this idea that we talked about, that the game seemed too flippant from last time, right, was something that is very hard. So if you look at this trailer is the Marines are doing most of the talking, right? The president of the company itself is missing completely.
Right. You have the narrator. You have the woman's voice narrating it in sort of this very dramatic tone. Very dramatic tone, right? You can clearly it's an Iraqi woman. At the end of that trailer, they have two Iraqi men speaking. And we'll get to that in a moment. But mostly it's the Marines, right? And we talked about how the biggest criticism, right, that the game got last time was essentially that it was disrespectful by making a game out of the lives of the Marines. And here you have these Marines pitching the game, which is very smart in my opinion. Right. Sure. Clearly, it shows that they were concerned about the Marines, and it seems like the lesson was really clearly learned. And the Marines themselves they're asking for you to understand, to get the opportunity to understand what their experience, was like. Right. My other big thing from this is like, wow, there is a very clear political stance here. There is. You think so? Oh yeah. Oh, it is very clear who the bad guys are here. Last time we talked about how controversial the Iraq War was, right? And how controversial any of this stuff was. And when I looked at this trailer, I didn't see any of that ambiguity, right? Right. That's true. Right. Right. Yeah, for sure. Right away, you see Zarqawi. Right away, you see men in masks. You're saying no one else was willing to stand up for them. To them, these are the terrorists. The Marines are the good guys. The good bad situation here is really, really, really clear. Insurgents bad, right? Although it does do a pretty good job of separating the Al Qaeda in Iraq from the Iraqis. Yeah, right. It doesn't just say all Iraqis are bad. It's being very pointed that this was an army that came in and took Fallujah, and then the U.S. came and took it back. Right. Though again, in the historical context, it's not like that's a little less clear, right? Right, but at least the way it's presenting it's not presenting it as all Iraqis are bad. Right. It's presenting it as, look, the soldiers were clearly the good guys, and they're there to protect the Iraqis. Right. And I'm not saying that narrative is wrong, but and it's probably exactly what the American forces that were there felt like. Yeah, I think so. I mean, talking to specific veterans, I feel like most of them really truly believe that narrative. And again, I'm not saying that narrative is wrong, but certainly I think that there's a lot more complexity, and we talked about the complexity of this last time, and certainly that part is kind of missing, right? Right. So we kind of we see the soldiers, we don't see the enemy, right? The enemy is kind of faceless here, and the only time you in this trailer where you actually see the enemy, there's like faceless enemies kind of far away, and they're yelling Allahu Akbar, right? And we've got essentially the faceless terrorist in the same way that, that we have the Nazi and the zombie as the category of people that it's okay to kill. It's sort of interesting because they're repitching it basically as a horror game, right? It's a military shooter, but they're pitching it like it's a horror game. They're talking about how scared the soldiers were. They're presenting it in very scary ways, as shadowy figures in a distance, and faceless monsters, right? They're presenting it as something that can jump out and get you at any moment. they're presenting it as a horror game, and that's kind of interesting to me.
Well, though it's interesting, right? It has horror elements, but at the end of the game, at the end of the day, so there's all these scenes of you, right, going into homes, and the layout is always different, and that's part of what they're touting as, which is really interesting, I think.
Yeah. There's a handful of things that are making me very interested in playing this game just from a technical standpoint, right? The procedural map layouts, the squad AIs that you command in a first-person shooter environment. That's super interesting and hasn't been done very well to date.
And this idea, right, that you're going through, that you are getting the experience of the Marines, right? Now,
right, they're trying to get to a specific emotional core experience that they're saying is what you share, which is the way that the soldiers felt while they were there.
Right. And they have those.
That's how they're presenting it.
Right, and they have those soldiers there to kind of back it up. Here's what I was feeling, and you're going to get to feel what I feel. It's interesting that the trailer for this one, it ends with the voice of an Iraqi woman saying, "We can tell you our stories, we can tell you our scars, but some moments must be experienced."
Right.
Which is interesting because partly, I mean, that's the power of games, right? But on the other hand, this seems that the stories, hopefully this means that the stories are going to be not just those of the soldiers, but because this is an Iraqi woman saying this, we will, at least from the trailer, all we saw are soldiers. I'd be hoping that if we have an Iraqi woman saying this, that we are going to actually go through the actual experiences of Iraqi civilians. And I'm less confident about that part.
Right. And I mean, to a certain degree, they seem to be trying to thread this thing where they're trying to create a horror game, but they're also trying to create a documentary. They're trying to create basically the documentary experience of this is what it was like there, as spoken by, with talking heads, the real people who were there. It kind of reminds me of, there's a handful of these daytime documentary style reality shows about like missing persons and murderers who go from state to state, and they're all sort of shot with this sort of like this breathlessness and like the intensity of the experience. And then they interview the people all over the people involved in the cases. They talk to the police and the families, and they are a thing, right? It feels like one of those shows.
Which is interesting. Of course, those shows we know are dramatized. In this case, we're talking about things that really happened. And of course, mind you, okay, I mean, those crimes really happened in those shows. But there's something to me that...
And this war happened. And, people did die. And we need to be respectful of that.
Right. And it's interesting because, when it's melodramatic, sometimes I feel like it's disrespectful. In a sense, right? Because it's beyond the realism of the drama. So far, I don't feel that about this game. I feel like, the drama part seems real. I'd be scared shitless, if I was in that
absolutely.
situation.
I don't want to do it.
Right?
It'd be terrifying. But so let me point out first off, we still don't have the game to play.
Right.
So we're still only reacting to their way that they're presenting the game in their publicity.
Absolutely.
So we're going to have to come back to this at some point and talk about the actual game. But talking about just the way they're presenting it, both in that trailer and in the second trailer, they make it out to be more dangerous than it actually was. And I wonder if let's talk about the ethics of the way that the game is portraying danger to the soldiers.
I think that's, before we do that, can I show part of that trailer? Because let's say I was going to do the fatal tunnel.
The person who goes in first is never wrong. They have the most to fear.
And as soon as I walk in, I see a machine gun right in front of my face, maybe 10 feet, 15 feet from me.
Every time we would go into one of those buildings, you never know what to expect.
You don't know the layout of the house until you get in there. And then you still don't know it until you go all the way through it.
Room clearing, house clearing, it's different every single time.
Marines and soldiers never knew what was waiting for them behind the next door. And if you want a realistic experience, neither can you. 6 Days in Fallujah reshapes the battlefield every time you play. Each room, each building, even the entire neighborhood is generated procedurally. Every map is a new map. So just like actual combat, you'll never know what to expect.
Okay, right. So, right, this idea of the fatal funnel, right? That you have to go through this door and you don't know what's on the other side, right? It looks super dangerous. So why are you questioning it?
So I'm sure it was very dangerous, and what I absolutely don't want to do is undermine anybody's real lived experience, right? But at the same time, if you're trying to present this game as a realistic depiction of danger, you have to look at the stats. We had 10,500 troops. The U.S. fielded 10,500 people into that battle, the Second Battle of Fallujah, of which 95 were killed and another 560 were wounded. So total casualties, less than 1% of the forces that were there.
And these are coalition forces or American forces?
Specifically U.S. forces. Okay. The Iraq provisional government had some forces there, 2,000 more forces. The British had about 850. Each of those also suffered less than 1% of their forces as casualties.
Right.
So it was actually quite safe. But of course, that's not an interesting game.
And it's not the experience of that particular group of Marines, right? So your squad, right?
Right. So
your squad might be
what they're doing is
danger.
they're kind of, I mean, and I understand why they're doing it, right? Because the game has to be interesting and dramatic, and getting shot, 1% of the time is not going to be particularly interesting or dramatic. But they're also trying to present the game as being extremely realistic, and there's a mismatch there, right? The realism and the drama that they're creating, they're saying one thing and doing the other, and I wonder if what do you think about that ethically?
To me, this is so complicated because, they want to be realistic, and they are being realistic from the perspective of this particular squad, let's say, or from the perspective of those people. But, again, part of it is this larger context. You're not misrepresenting the experiences of those Marines whose stories they were choosing to use, but those stories are not representative of the experiences of all of the forces there in general. And
right. That's probably the better way of looking at it, right? They're trying to recreate the experiences of a very specific set of people,
though
who did suffer.
Right. Though lots of, so, even for all the people that didn't die, where you say it, 1%, let's say, died.
Right. I'm sure they're all terrified.
Right. And,
Right.
and still you're talking about, there's still obviously lots of casualties beside the ones who died. But yeah, I think that part is interesting. Again, I think this is, the whole thing is just so challenging, right? To do. And we don't want the player to be miseducated about what it was really like. So, this idea that everybody that they're seeing are just this nameless evil people, that fall under the banner of Al Qaeda, when they also know that lots of the people there were locals that saw the insurgents as the freedom fighters protecting them against the American invaders. And that stories, it's interesting, right? This going back to this idea of our stories. How many Iraqi stories that we're going to hear that are going to challenge the dominate pro-American narrative? I'm assuming none, but maybe,
right?
Maybe
we don't know,
right?
Yeah, I mean, my only real criticism of the trailers, again, I'm looking forward to seeing what the game is, because I first off, I celebrate their bravery in doing and making a game that challenges a lot of these sort of assumptions about what games can be.
Yes.
But if they are trying to create a documentary, I think they have a higher level of responsibility for making sure it's accurate. So, like, are they going to deal with the white phosphorus question?
Apparently, yes, from what I understand.
Okay.
Again, we can't say too much that we're working off the trailer and not the game, right? But let's not repeat it too often so our listeners don't get bored, right?
Right.
But a lot of this idea, because they said this is partly a documentary, you know, that they are going to intersperse the action with documentary footage. And that part of the documentary footage is supposed to deal with the white phosphorus.
Okay.
Now, deal with can mean lots of things. Right.
If they raise the issue at all, I'll be surprised and impressed, because it's about, you know, starting a conversation. Honestly, it just needs to be about, let's keep talking about this.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So before we leave that particular trailer, there's another part of this game. So this is the gameplay trailer, right? Where it shows that you're going into a house and you're finding a basement, and you kick open the door in the basement and you see a family of 4, right? And the player doesn't shoot, but you know, the game doesn't tell you if the player could have shot. And I'm dying to know how they're going to play this out, right? In the last Modern Warfare, they had a kind of scene where, you know, they had a few scenes where you're going door to door like this, and you could potentially kill the civilians. And if you do, that's bad. Clearly, right? And they kind of, you lose your mission, right? You got to restart the mission. But I'm curious if they're going to go further than that in some way. If, let's say, I would love it if you keep going and feel the guilt of what happened and get into that. But again, I'm worried about triggering. You know, this is one of those things where this is so hard, right? On the one hand, you want to adequately represent the stories of that family. What would have been like? You know, you are in your own home. These are soldiers kicking down the door while you're hiding in your basement in your own home, right?
That's right.
And
we can simulate some fear, but we can't get the real kind of fear that you're talking about.
Well, especially if all we're doing is focusing on the perspective of the soldiers. Right. And, you know, this is the soldiers are powerful. They might be scared, but they are the powerful agents here. And when that Marine talked about we lost hundreds and hundreds, well, they lost hundreds of civilians. And we don't know who killed those civilians or how those civilians died or how many of those civilians died because of this door-to-door combat.
Right. And in fact, that actually brings up something that I didn't see. They were very, very cagey in the trailer. They never showed us a body. They never showed us, like, they showed people shooting and firing weapons, but they never showed any bodies. And I don't know how they're going to, we don't know from the trailer how they're going to present the bodies.
You know, are there military shooters where the bodies are treated in a special way? It's an interesting point. You know, I've literally never given the bodies any thought.
Right, and a lot of shooters is because they go away.
Right. Yeah, they just disappear to clear the playing field, and you know they harm visibility. Right? I mean, they become objects in the way.
They're messy, and they're ugly, and they don't fall in ways that are artistically valuable, right? So
unless you're showing people grieving over them, right? Which sometimes happens.
You're allowing people to do, you know, to do mock dances over them or whatever.
Right.
Right. I mean, we see that a lot in shooters too.
Okay, so to go back to the scene, right? So you have these 4 people, then you have the player, you know, and the Marine then comes up and says, you know, you have this Marine and you're amped and you've got all this adrenaline going through you and you kick that door down and there's this family of 4. And I expected, you know, him to be like, and you got to be very careful about not killing anyone accidentally. But instead he says,
right.
And I'm talking to the dad, and I'm like, dude, why are you still here? And I did not expect that at all, you know. But
it's a real interesting question, right?
Right.
That's a great learning moment for anybody playing this game. Why did people stay there? They were told to get out,
right? And it's interesting because it makes it seem like, and they make a thing of this right later on in the trailer, right? I kind of felt like, first of all, you just had this really great opportunity to kind of talk about how careful you have to be. But it also seems to imply that the soldiers coming in believed that the city was empty and everybody that they could see would be an insurgent.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that.
Was that the case?
I don't. Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. Surely not.
You would think they would have figured this out pretty quickly, or maybe the majority of the people left. So in this trailer, right at the end, they have this kind of explanation about this, right? And the explanation says that the prime minister goes on TV and tells everybody Zarqawi is in Fallujah, and the coalition forces with the rocket, they're going to take him down. And he told people to leave, right? And most people did, but then and they have a couple of guys talking about this, and they're hidden so you can't see their faces to protect them, because this is. Obviously, this could still be a danger to their life, right? Even today, right? But this guy mentions that his dad wouldn't leave because old Fallujahs think it's shameful to leave their homes to be occupied.
Yeah.
Which is, it's weird to me. I kind of felt like the Iraqis are sort of in this trailer, but not. These are the only two Iraqis in this trailer, but not really. It kind of made me feel like watching the game, like. Everybody was out, and the only people that were left were kind of, there because of either their own ignorance or naivety, or maybe they were kind of like stubborn, old school Fallujahs with their silly sense of honor, instead of, let's say, old Fallujahs that, might have said, look, this is my home. I'm not leaving.
Right. And I didn't see it as being presented in a silly way. I didn't feel like they were being mocked.
Not at all. It's not that they were mocking them, but you can still you could still say, well, that's just the old-fashioned old people, let's say, that didn't want to leave. And they're leaving out the whole thing about no males over the age of 15 to 55 were allowed to leave.
Right.
So obviously, if I'm a male between 55 and 15, right? So
you would have been stuck there.
I would have been stuck there. And
probably assumed to be one of Zarqawi's guys.
Potentially, right? And what if I didn't want my family to leave? And what if I was also in a culture where, let's say, my wife was supposed to listen to me, right? The more religious I am, right, the more that's a possibility, right? So, women, children, and elderly was allowed to leave. But some families just wanted to stay together. I mean, this is already a war with so many refugees to begin with, right? I mean, some of the people that stayed never saw their family again. The whole thing is so complicated.
It'll be super interesting to see what they do with this.
Yes.
Right. It'll be one of these games that even though I'm not a big shooter fan, I will have to play this game just to see how they handle this, because it'll be, because nobody's reaching for this sort of stuff. Nobody's trying to do this, and it's super important. I think it's super important that they try.
Absolutely. It's interesting. I feel like I have lots of criticism so far of what I've seen, but those criticisms are shortcomings, and you don't get shortcomings without actually trying. And I really salute the fact that they're trying to do this, and I think it's great. It's interesting. Of the people criticizing this game, it's mostly from the left, right? And it's sort of, I think, criticisms of the kind that I've had so far, that, they're worried that they've gone too far to essentially praising the soldiers and not enough to be thinking about the Iraqi. I've read a few places call this U.S. military propaganda.
It's interesting because in the original game, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, was being criticized from the right.
Right. So we kind of got from both sides. So I ran into a quote from Anita Sarkeesian. So Anita Sarkeesian, we're both fans, right? She's a cultural critic and a critic also of game culture. Her parents were born and raised in Iraq. And she said this prior to the trailer's release, which is interesting, right? This was about the way the developer described the game. The developer statements very carefully acknowledge the Iraqi casualties, but they're not providing any context about the fact that the heroes of this story are murdering people who are defending themselves and their homeland, of people who have been targeted repeatedly over the years by world powers, including the U.S.
She's taking the bigger contextual picture, right? these are people who have been under fire for the better part of 70 years.
Right, though not just that, right? I mean, that's the very, very big picture, right? And it's interesting, right? Because obviously from the American picture here, the context doesn't really start till the Marines get on the ground in Fallujah or something like that, right?
Right.
And from the Iraqi context is, look, we have another colonial invader potentially, right? And you know, things like this. So the context can be very different, but the claim that you are making a hero out of murderers. I mean, wow, is that provocative? Now, I'm not here going to say that the Marines are murdering people. I don't think it's at all clear what's going on. I think Iraq is an extremely morally ambiguous war with a lot of bad actors. And even if they are wrongly killing people, and the typical definition of murder is it's not just killing, right? It's intentional wrongful killing. You know, even if they are intentionally killing people, certainly they don't think they are. You know, again, I certainly think that most individual soldiers here are usually brave and believe that they're helping. But, you know, even though you don't see this perspective articulated in the U.S., it's not rare to see this interpretation of what would have happened in the Second Battle of Fallujah in places like Iraq. And it might even be the more common interpretation worldwide of what happened in Fallujah.
Potentially, this game was going to get a worldwide release, so I suspect we're going to find out.
I'm assuming this game is going to get a worldwide release. It looks like a really well-done game, right?
Right. And so I'm assuming that we're going to find out how people in other countries, like whether this game reflects what they think about the Second Battle of Fallujah or not.
Well, I think it's easy. I mean, it's not that hard to look at, global opinion polls about what people thought about the Iraq War.
But I think that's a larger, again, that's sort of the bigger context.
Yes.
That the game is not about, or hasn't said that they're going to try to cover.
Right. But they are talking specifically about Fallujah. And again, right, Fallujah could be its own thing, right? That isn't necessarily connected to, even if the war is bad, Fallujah could be great. I want to know kind of, given that this is such a common perspective of what happened, right? And this game is supposed to be a documentary. Can this game just ignore this perspective? Does it have some responsibility to address it in some way, or at least acknowledge that it exists?
I don't know that it does. I think that if it's very clear about what it is trying to be about, it needs to give you enough context about what it is trying to be about to give you that story. But I don't know that it needs to be about everything that connects to that. I mean, there's an editorial decision that has to be made about, like, how big is this game going to be? How big is this topic?
Right. And though it's interesting, right? I mean, again, let's say we're just staying with the battle itself, right? If the interpretation that most people in the world have, and again, I'm not sure it's true, but certainly a major interpretation is what happens in this battle is that U.S. soldiers go and cause the death of hundreds of innocent people. To me, this seems to be within the scope.
If it's about the U.S. soldiers' experience in these, I mean, they're even shortening it down. The Battle of Fallujah is actually much longer than 6 days.
What is the goal of all this, and are we just expecting too much? Again, part of this expectation is so high because there's never been anything like it, and you're trying to pile up everything you would want something like this to be into one thing, and you're not letting them tell a damn story, right?
Right.
I mean, no story can, and even though this story can be so much longer than a movie, and this isn't just a story, this is an experience.
Right. And it may sound like I'm pre-apologizing for them, but I'm not. I'm just trying to, like, draw some lines around our critical critical discussion of what they're trying to do.
Right.
Right. And it's hard to do that. It's hard to know what they're trying to do without actually seeing the thing that they've done.
Right. So, and again, and we got to remember this idea about the documentary segments. So they did say that the game is going to have these documentary segments. So you have these missions, and you're playing the Marines, and then you have documentary segments, which itself is super interesting. I remember reading a review of I think a Vietnam game that had some like this, where the review was like the documentary segments were super boring, and kind of over the top. But to me,
right. And remember, and when people play games and they get to the cutscenes, they just skip them.
It depends what the game is to you. I'm obviously going to be looking at these things because I want to know what they're presenting here. But they're saying that they're going to discuss many tough topics, including the events and political decisions that led to the Fallujah battles, as well as their aftermath.
Great.
Super. That's super interesting. We'll see how they do that, and then including the white phosphorus thing.
Right. I think that's going to be what's going to be really interesting about that from a player's point of view is that it'll make you feel differently about what you're doing as you play.
Right.
And the battles may seem kind of similar just because of the way that they're doing their procedurally generated terrain. So you can make them feel different by giving them different contexts.
Which is interesting. Yeah, I didn't even think about that design aspect. I was thinking of, wow, this is a great way to potentially get them to ethically reflect about what they just did, or maybe prepare them for what happens next, which is interesting, right? Because you would assume the way they are probably going to do it is you play a mission and then you get context about that mission, though it could be kind of before or after. So they say that they're trying to offer a perspective into urban warfare, which is interesting because they use urban warfare, right? Mm-hmm. This idea of what it's like to be in the soldier's position, again, kind of narrowing what it is that they're focusing on. So they didn't say the Iraq War, a perspective into the Iraq War, right? And a perspective into urban warfare that it just isn't possible through other media. And that part that's itself, I think, a great and noble aim. I love that.
It also seems like they're, gameplay wise, they focused very, very closely onto one kind of experience with their gameplay, which is urban warfare, which is cool. It means that they're not trying to do those like, and now we're going to go to the snow level, and now we're going to go to the ice, the sand level. No, we're not. That's not what they're doing here. They're being very specific about their gameplay. They're focusing, so they have the ability to edit, like they have editorial control in regards to their gameplay, and it's interesting to see whether or not they'll have that same kind of tight editorial control about what they present in the bigger context of the war.
Yeah, that's great. It's interesting. Now that I'm thinking about it, urban warfare, the same thing, just on randomized maps, seems kind of boring to me. As I want to go to the snow level. I want to go to the sand level. Those varieties, right? Really help. And it's interesting what they can do with that. And I don't know, maybe they thought of a really good way to do that.
Right. What's the final boss going to be? Right. I mean, we come to expect certain things from games that if you're making something that's very documentary, you're not going to be able to do.
I mean, you don't capture Zarqawi. Right? That doesn't happen till years later. Here's in total what I think about this, just to kind of wrap it up from my perspective anyway. The fact that we can find so many things to be concerned about with these trailers, I think really kind of underscores how complicated the whole thing is and the ethical challenge that a game like this presents. And I've been wanting this game to happen for a long time. And I want other games to take these sorts of risks. And I think this is already an improvement over the 2009 version, and that's good.
Good.
And even if this game is released and fails in certain ways, that's totally fine with me. I think they're trying, and this is a process, and there'll be lessons learned from the successes and failures that will hopefully motivate other major studios to take chances and make some more serious games that tackle real-world themes.
I fully agree with that. Good podcast.
GP. All right, play nice. You can subscribe and listen to all of our episodes wherever you listen to podcasts.